What's up, everybody? I am sitting here with Danny Schreiber. Danny Schreiber is the producer of a podcast called Digital Pathology Today. He has a deep background in news journalism. He's been a news producer for over 25 years, has experience with print, online, and broadcast journalism, has won several local Emmy Awards. He currently lives in Portland, Oregon, along with his wife, two kids, two cats, and a dog. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you inviting me on.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to talk to you about kind of the divide between journalism versus. We kind of had a little conversation about that before hitting record, but we want to get into first digital pathology today. You have a unique start compared to some other podcasters, so you can tell us like the birth, the idea, how did that come to be, and what is the kind of the goal for that podcast?
Absolutely. So the show is relatively new, started in October of 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. And it's a category that I knew nothing about. This is a specialty field of pathology, which is a subset, basically a doctor, medical thing. And I have no background in medicine at all, but I am a news person. I'm a news producer. And we actually had some experts in the field who wanted to begin doing this podcast, and they approached me to be the producer behind it. And basically, we went and interviewed a number of different hosts and finally got somebody put together. And we work with a marketing team to do all the outreach. And it's unique because we started the show with an actual funder. It was the actual funder who wanted to do the show. And for full disclosure, I'm related to the funder, so that kind of helps when we got a relationship there. So, but of course, what happened is they knew that I had the background in production and in news, and so that I became basically the producer of it, the creator of the show, and I work on every episode, basically, interviewing, do pre-interviews with all the guests, and set all that up, and then do the outreach to marketing and kind of as well as the advertising side of it, getting the sponsorship. So that's kind of my background on it. So I act as that side, but I'm lucky because I do have a team that I work with that has that whole ability to do everything else. But again, as a news producer, I have ability to edit. I have ability to do interviews. I have ability to write. I can certainly do marketing. I run the website, those things. But what I've learned in my 25 years of being a producer is a producer is kind of like a housing contractor, a contractor for a house, is that sure the contractor could build the wall, but you go and find the expert who's good at putting up the wall and who's good at painting, and you don't do it yourself. You find someone else who can, and you've got that team of experts together, and that's why you become a good contractor. That's why you become a good producer, is you're able to outsource and find folks who can, are best at it. So that's kind of where my role is on the show, and we are definitely a very niche podcast, that's for sure. Very, very targeted. It's fun for me as a journalist and as a news person. I love learning new things, and so this has been a whole year of learning things I had no idea about. I didn't even know what pathology meant 6 months ago or a year ago, and now I've become a pseudo expert, which I think again that's what journalists are. We're jack of all trades, and we know a little bit about a lot of things. Not a lot about a little bit. So,
and that's what
I've become, and it's fun. It's great to hear these stories, and I think for especially I work in it's the medical field. Doctors aren't necessarily the best communicators always. So as a producer, sometimes I have to work with them to make sure that they know what the best story is to tell and how to tell it. So when I do my pre-interviews, sometimes I work with them. I say, let's focus on this and focus on that, because they can get into the weeds of that, and we want to make sure that they tell a good story. But that's the show itself. And of course, Digital Pathology Today is the name of the program, so you're welcome to take a listen to it. I don't know if anyone will even find it interesting, but the pathologists do, that's for sure.
Awesome. Hey, I have somebody draining water right outside my house, so we're going to take a short break here. Can you hear that?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Okay.
Background noises happen.
Yeah. I just want to make sure I can cut that out. So, okay. We're back. Okay, so you got started with funding. What kind of cost does that Like, what kind of funding does it take to launch a podcast? If you're gonna say, hey, I'm funding this, I'm not gonna do anything besides hire somebody to do it for me. Like, what is a total cost for a production like that?
Well, and everything, actually, all the productions I've worked in 25 years, everything is scalable, which
Mm-hmm.
is a great term to use that I still like to use when I talk to clients. It depends on what you want to do and what your budget is, and then we can adjust it from there. So
Mm-hmm.
I know it's kind of it's a not answer, but it really just depends. And obviously, this funder who came on board, they gave me a budget, and I was able to work with that. And it meant that I had to do some things myself. I did a little bit of the website design and that kind of thing, which normally I would have outsourced, but it didn't fit within
Yeah,
their budget to do the outsourcing. So that's
totally.
again good that I have this skill and knowledge that I can do, so I can throw in some parts of it. And then as the podcast expands, as we get more viewers, as we get more sponsors, then we can outsource even more of it and
Mm-hmm.
go that way. We were fairly tight. I mean, we put in a budget for an outside editor, so we have a third-party editor who does the actual show engineering, the sound engineering on it. Of course, budget for the hosting services and the web, web domain and URL and that
Yeah,
stuff, as well as a budget for the marketing. The marketing was probably the most expensive part of it, and
sure.
because of course that's really what we needed. We needed to get an audience, and
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's where a lot of news people and podcasters fall short, is we don't think about the audience and not think about who's going to be listening. And we had a very defined
Mm-hmm.
audience, and we knew exactly how to reach them. So we went with a marketing company that had a mailing list of 35,000 pathologists. That's kind of their
Wow.
target audience. They work with pathologists all the time, and they had this group of 35,000 pathologists on their mailing list, and we bought their mailing list and had them do the marketing for it and do the outreach, which any podcaster, if you've got an idea for a show, think first who your audience is, and kind of work it
Mm-hmm.
backwards and target who that audience is and who can reach that audience. So, for example, if you're doing a show about senior issues, talk to your local AARP office, or there's got to be a retired person's office. Maybe there's a mailing list you can rent from them and do a direct mail to them. When I say mailing, I'm talking email lists. I don't know if anyone does a physical
Yeah,
mailing, but you could do that too. If that's where your audience is, if they only read physical mail, do a
yeah.
postcard. Postcards aren't that expensive, believe it or not. The
Mm-hmm.
mailing part is, but the printing is fairly inexpensive. You can get 1,000 postcards for like $30. It's not a very expensive investment into it. Of course, mailing, it's 50 cents a piece to mail them, but there's fulfillment houses that will do that for you as well. You can do it that way. Sometimes
Yeah.
actually doing mailing, for example, if you're a community podcast and you only reach your neighborhood, getting the 1,000, 6,000 names of your community. Sometimes, Chamber of Commerce will give those to you. Sometimes the
Mm-hmm.
City Hall might give them to you. Local newspapers, local media will rent you their lists. And there's great ways to do that marketing stuff. And that could be a whole nother episode where we talk about ways to reach your audience. But that's why I think a lot of people fall short is I hear, podcasters and
So true.
producers and hosts say, how do I reach my audience? And I ask them, who's your audience? And you need to
Yeah.
know that. That's the first thing you need to know is who are you trying to reach? And in our case, it was very well defined. They knew right away we wanted to reach pathologists, we wanted to reach IT folks, we wanted to reach healthcare executives. So it was a fairly easy reach for the first round of audience. And now I think as we get into our next year, second season, now we need to expand our reach a little bit to get some of those outliers who aren't the
Mm-hmm.
exact target, but still might find it interesting and still might find our content something that's relevant
For
to their
sure.
day-to-day business. But
Yeah,
I
I
guess I went
think
on for your answer. But yeah, that's
I,
kind of
I
where we
think
started,
I
and
think
it
you're
was scalable.
totally right with the marketing so important that's so forgotten. I tell people all the time, podcast is like a website. You can have the best podcast in the world. You can have the best website in the world that converts everybody that goes there. But if nobody goes there, doesn't matter. Same with podcasts. You got the best podcast in the world, nobody goes to it, doesn't matter. So to think about the marketing from the get-go, I think that's one of the advantages of hiring somebody, like you, that's going to walk them through, like, okay, most of our budget is going to have to be spent on marketing right away because it it doesn't matter if we produce the show if nobody comes. So
Yeah.
uh, do you know kind of like the breakdown, or can you disclose the breakdown of what percent of the funding initially went to marketing versus production costs?
It was for production costs. I mean, if you consider me part of the production costs,
Yeah.
it was about a 50-50. So 50% of it went to marketing, 50% of it went to the other part of it. So yeah, we spend a lot on marketing. I mean, that's where the big push was, because again, if you don't, as you said, if you don't have the audience, you don't have listeners. I mean, and we'll probably continue to do that in that range. It may back off a little bit as we become established, because we know we've got subscribers now. And once you get subscribers, as you know, you don't have to still push as hard. But as I mentioned, we want to expand it now. Now we've got a whole nother category that we're moving into, and we want to reach out to that area. We actually, our first target was U.S.-based pathologists here in the United States, and we realized right away when we started looking at the numbers that we were getting about a third of our listeners coming from around the globe that weren't U.S. pathologists. So that's what triggered the idea of, oh, we need to start, obviously we need to go beyond just the U.S. because there's people who are listening to us without even trying. They were finding us and trying to listen to the podcast that way. So that's probably going to be our next goal, is to go a little bit beyond the U.S. folks and go to international. And of course, then it makes it more appealing for sponsors, because all of a sudden you've got a bigger base.
Exactly.
There's that fine line, because there's a certain point at when you just start to get a lot of what we call in the advertising business clutter, and those are advertisers that you don't, audiences that you don't necessarily need or want, but they're there and they fill in the numbers, but are the exact people you want? And it depends on who the advertiser is, because some like that clutter, some don't. It depends on what their message is as the advertiser and the sponsor, what they are. And early on, I told all of our folks that we wanted to make sure that we were very careful and we're not selling ads on our podcast, but more sponsorships, because one of the dangers when you sell ads per se is there's usually that cost per million, the CPM that they're trying to evaluate, to say, oh, you have this many, audience members, and I'm going to pay $1 per audience member. And I wanted to avoid that, because especially when you're in the news business, and I remember when I worked in local news, we were constantly chasing ratings. Every night you're looking at your score to see where you're higher or lower or whatever. And, in the internet, it's, chasing clicks. When you do that, you set up a situation where you don't necessarily get the best content. You're not necessarily getting the best interview, because you know that if I interview, person X, I'm going to get more clicks. Well, okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best content, just because it's a great get or a great name.
Yeah, it's more vanity metrics.
Yeah, you're chasing those metrics, but you may not get the best content. It may not be the best interview. So sometimes, for example, I'll give you an example of one of our episodes. We had an episode which was very, very fascinating, talking about, for pathologists, how to choose a piece of equipment, which is a boring piece of equipment. It was about monitors, viewing scopes, and very, very boring, very mundane, but very important for them. But it didn't get that many views, and it didn't, wasn't a huge episode. But if you listen to the episode, it's actually something that they really need to know. But it's not as sexy and cool as others. And one of those things, especially with podcasts, because the episode will be there forever. When someone's looking, in a year from now, looking to purchase or have to upgrade one of these pieces of equipment, they're going to go back and listen to that episode and go, oh, I'm glad somebody did that interview and talked all about it and compared it. And there will be an audience for it, even though, again, it may not have been our biggest, listenership. We didn't have the biggest numbers on it, but it stays there. That's a great thing also about podcasting, is
but it could be more, and it could be a higher converting, episode as well. I want to get into, like, you didn't get sponsors, from the get-go. You had the funding, but you weren't sponsored. When did you get sponsored? How many downloads were you getting? I know you weren't charging per download, but it kind of gives us an idea of, a ballpark of where you were before somebody said yes.
And that was my again, another little debate with the team, is that I was putting, they said, oh, we want to push to 10,000 downloads. I think we got our first sponsor committed at around 5,000 downloads. And
are you talking per episode?
No, total.
Or per month?
Total. 5,000 episodes. We're averaging right now, and again, we're 7 months into it, we're averaging about 3,000 downloads per episode. That's after all these months.
On a weekly
show.
Early on,
it was, a few hundred per episode. But as soon as we reached that 5,000 total downloads, as I think is when we got our first sponsor. But in honesty, it really had nothing to do with the number of downloads. I don't think they even knew. They had just listened to the content. They had seen who we were interviewing. They saw the category of who we were reaching and said, That's who we want. I mean, I was trained as a news person that, of course, the biggest thing is to always make sure you got to get the funding, because that's one of the things about the news season. But I was always trained that if you make really, really good content, the audience will follow. They're going to want to listen to it, and then the advertisers are going to want to reach that audience. And so it's just kind of this chain. As long as you make great content, the audience will find it, and then the advertisers will find them. And so that's what I was pushing with our team, is let's just keep making really good shows, really good interviews, and then keep trying to reach that audience. Keep doing that outreach, that marketing. And then eventually the advertisers are just going to notice. And actually that happened fairly early on, which was, this was strange. And this has never happened to me before, but some of our first sponsors reached out to me. They had contacted me and asked me to run ads, which is odd. This has not happened very often, but at least our first, well, not our first one, but our second and third sponsor contacted me through LinkedIn and then through our email on our website and asked me, how do we buy ads? So that is a great sign that you're reaching the right audience and that you're getting great content, because that means that somebody else is noticing it and said, hey, we want to be a part of this. We want to reach your audience. And
that's cool.
That is rare. In my 25 years, I can maybe think of once or twice when I've ever gotten a call about someone trying to buy that. Usually it's me having to call them and say, hi, here, we're doing this podcast, if you want to be a part of it. And so, and that's the other thing. My other piece of advice is you got to ask. That's the hardest thing, is you've got to ask advertisers. And that's what I think a lot of people are scared to do, or they're, they just don't want, for whatever reason, don't want to do it. But sometimes you just have to put the ask out there. Say, hey, do you want to be a sponsor? If they say no, you go, great. Thank you anyway, but you got to make the ask. Otherwise, just, they don't even know.
Let's talk about that a little bit before I get into the next thing I wanted to talk about. So directly asking sponsors, going out and kind of beating the bush and that kind of stuff, versus using a Podcorn or these other that facilitate the conversation for you. What are the advantages or disadvantages of each, in your opinion?
Well, I can only talk for this podcast, but in my past experience, I've always really done niche programming and really gone for very targeted audiences. So I know exactly who my audience is. And, the big broad sponsors, sure, they're fine if you get enough numbers. You got 50,000 listeners. Anybody's going to want to reach 50,000 general people. But in this case, I've got even better that I know I've got 50,000 pathologists who are making purchases of microscopes and slides, and I don't know what else the other things that they work with. And I can go right to those slide companies and say, listen, I've got your customers. Here's your chance to reach them. And that's when they get excited, because they can't go to Podcorn and advertise on any podcast, because what's the point for them to do that if they're making, a doohickey that's only for a targeted customer? So for our case, it's that as well. We, as I mentioned before, we have a very strict separation of church and state. So we will sometimes interview somebody who's a sponsor, but there's no connection between the two at all. And I very much make that clear in our pre-interviews, that I talk with folks and say, hey, we'd love to have you as a sponsor, but we'd also love to have you as an interview. And they're not connected in any way. If you want to sponsor, great. If you don't want to sponsor, that's fine too. And that's how we've done all of our shows. And I think that helps to keep the integrity of our show a little bit higher, so we're able to attract that. To answer your question about Podcorn, I haven't had a lot of experience with the general ads. In most cases, from all the products that I've worked on before, all the other shows, very, very few dollars come in that way. In the old days, it used to be through ad agencies. And my experience with working with ad agencies, which I guess you could kind of call a Podcorn as an ad agency in essence, where they're trying to connect an advertiser with a show and a show with an advertiser kind of thing, is that it doesn't, for me, it's always takes a lot of work, it takes a whole lot of effort to try to get it for not a lot of payoff. Because for somebody like a Podcorn or someone like that, they don't care if they're going to put it on my show or any show. It doesn't matter to them. They're going to get their commission either way. They're going to get their money no matter what show it is. So they're not selling my show necessarily. They're just selling in general. And same thing with ad agencies. And I don't want to badmouth ad agencies too much because they do help bring in great content too. And I work with a lot of ad agencies on the creative side, making the actual, ad message or creative artwork or whatever. But the ad agency isn't going to be selling your show. They could be selling your competitor's show. They don't care. They really don't care. They just, as long as they get their commission. So that's why I find it a little bit easier for me to make the call, the cold call. Nowadays it's email, the cold email, or whatever, and make that personal connection where I can really answer their questions. And you find out from your sponsor, what is it you need? What's your problem? What is it what can I help you solve? And they're always looking for that. When you say, well, we're not reaching this category of advertiser, or we're having problems, with this category of something, and you go, hey, we've got them. There are listeners. We are reaching this category. Let's work on it.
Yeah. So, from my perception, it kind of seems like when you reach out, you're kind of controlling the conversation of like, hey, here's my audience. Like, how can that help you, or what are you looking for? Like, and how can I help you with my audience? Versus a Podcorn or any service like that. It almost boils down like it has to be a CPM conversation. It has to be a cost per impression, because that's like the middleman. They don't get to know you. They don't get to know, and they don't get to know what the advertiser needs. So it almost has to come down to cost per impression.
Yeah,
That
and you're absolutely right. And sometimes what I've always been taught is that there's a value in a certain market, and sometimes, sure, Joe audience might be a certain CPM, but if you're getting a CEO, I mean, if you have a podcast and you can guarantee that, I'm just going to throw it, Jeff Bezos is your biggest fan and listens to it, that's valuable to somebody who's trying to reach in Amazon and wants to do a deal with Amazon, and they know that they've got Jeff Bezos' ear in your podcast or whatever. That's worth, I don't know, they could put any dollar amount on that of whatever that person thinks the value is. So that's why I hate, CPM is a great way to measure, but it's a hard way to measure the value of that customer, and also how engaged your audience is with it. Are they listening to 2 minutes, or are they listening to the whole podcast, or are they really engaged in it? Are they really invested in it? The hard part with all sponsors is, of course, you can't control the messaging, what they put out there. And sometimes I get frustrated when I hear an ad or hear something that they don't give me the name of the company, or they don't tell me the website, or you just spent money on an ad and you didn't tell me the name of your product.
Yeah, exactly.
And I go, I don't remember your product. And I'm talking as a listener, and you obviously as a podcaster, you can't control that. You can give them recommendations and say, by the way, you should probably mention the name of your product. And we do a little bit of that when our phone sponsors. What we usually do is we give them a 15 to 20 second billboard, audio recording within our podcast. I also include in there an intro to them. This episode is sponsored by name of the company, and then it goes into their sponsorship message. Because again, even our folks have forgotten to say their name, or they say it once at the very end of the ad. And I'm like, there's that old saying they say, when you're doing an ad, you want to say the name of the product or items at least 3 times. And so they always, that's a rule of 3 there in the ad world. I don't know if there's any science behind that or not, but that's kind of the phrase they say, at least say it 3 times. So if they've said it at least twice, we've said it once on the show for them. But that's the best we can do. In essence, what we also are selling for our show is the fact that they want to support the industry by just giving the money to make sure that we have this podcast there for folks, because there's some educational value to our show, obviously, because we're interviewing folks to talk about it. We're raising the bar a little bit within our show of the category. So I certainly mentioned that too, is that, showing your support as a sponsor, obviously helps to keep our lights on for the show, make sure the show keeps going. And in the same way, if more people know about what we do as a field and what your product is, obviously it's better that way. Digital pathology is really interesting because there are pathologists who don't use digital, and digital is basically, I hate to get into the weeds of the podcast, but the digital pathology is basically scanning, turning all of your slide, like when a doctor takes a skin sample or a cancer sample, believe it or not, nowadays it pretty much stays on a microscope like it has for 150 years. And this new field of digital pathology is putting it into the computer. And that's all it is. which seems like this should have happened like 30 years ago, but pathology never did. And they're just now starting to talk about it. So within their whole world of pathology, there's a debate that, we're going to become digital, which again, probably should have happened, decades ago. But
every other industry.
Yeah, they're just starting to figure it out. And part of the reason is that most of their slides, which I didn't realize, when you scan a slide, it's 4 gigabytes of data per slide. I'm sorry, 400. I say 400 gigabytes of data per slide.
That's crazy.
So it's a ton of information on that slide, which is why it's been so hard for them. But they're starting to catch up. So the folks that, the IT folks are involved. There's cloud storage folks. There's internet connection folks. Everyone's got to be, because they got to access this stuff quickly. Mm-hmm. So it's really raising the whole bar of the industry, the field up. So that's part of my pitch, is that we've got a platform that's helping to educate for free, because we're not charging for listeners, and we're doing it for free. We do have some competitors out there who are doing webinars and seminars and things like that, but they're charging for them. If you wanted to talk to this CEO of a company and hear their perspective, you got to pay for it for these other webinars. For our podcast, it's free. We're interviewing them for free, and they can download it for free, listen to it for free. So that's why we said to the sponsors, come and sponsor us, help support that. Even though it may not be your CEO we're interviewing, help support us. The other thing that I found that was fascinating, that early on, I thought that when we did an interview with somebody from a company, that company might want to sponsor that episode. We always give them as the option. We're interviewing your CEO. You want to sponsor it or not? Again, there's no connection. You don't have to. We're going to interview your CEO either way. That's kind of the way I always take it. Is I start first with the interview, and I say, would you like to sponsor it? And in most cases, it's been the competitor that's wanted to sponsor that one, and that CEO, that company, sponsors their competitor instead.
Yeah.
So it's just
That's
a different.
Funny.
I didn't realize that one was going to happen in this field. I thought they'd want to support their own folks, but instead they go, oh no, we want to, go after our competitor, and we'll have them we'll sponsor their episode instead. Which, again, we let that. There's a separation there, and there's no connection between the two, so they can absolutely do that. So that we have the CEO of one company being interviewed with the sponsor of the other company who's their competitor. And
so before we get into kind of that separation, which is what I want to end on today, because we're getting close to the end of our time, I just wanted to point out something that you said about when you're selling or kind of pitching your podcast to your potential sponsors or potential advertisers. The one leverage that you have on them is, like, if you have a podcast that fills a need and that is giving value, and people see it as, like, hey, this is valuable not only for me but for the industry, and you're a sponsor of that gives you more credit and more kind of authoritative points, if you will, than just like going on a Joe Rogan show, or a talk show or a news show or something that's kind of not pertaining to that industry which people involved. Because your listeners of Digital Pathology Today are probably heavily invested that this podcast keeps going because it's important to them. Whereas if Last Man Standing on TV, or whatever show on TV gets, that's their last season, well, there's that entertainment value, but there's not that deep personal, like, career connection value. So there's that kind of difference there when you're sponsoring a show like yours versus a talk show. So bringing that out in the conversation is important. So I want to talk about the topic of separating your kind of sponsored messages from editorial content that you're having, because with the rise of, and I think this was especially kind of evident through the COVID pandemic and all of the newscasting, and there's becoming a certain level of distrust in just mainstream media. So maybe people are looking more towards podcasting. And I know it's kind of one of your core values to keep that integrity. So can you just talk to us kind of the importance of calling that out on your podcast, making sure that your listener knows what is supported and what's not, and then how do you kind of wrap that into your podcast when you are having these sponsors come in and out?
Absolutely. You bring up an interesting point, is that we haven't really told our listener, much about it. I mean, we probably should, and we haven't. But I make very clear to all of our guests and all of our sponsors that there is a separation of church and state. You know, we have that integrity that we'd love for you to be a sponsor, but that is not going to influence how we do the coverage. And, you know, we're not a hard-hitting investigative news, anything like that. So I have to admit, you know, our questions that we do in our interviews are usually pretty softball, pretty easy. And so it's not like we're going to, you know, do a big investigation on somebody. But, you know, our host is very good about, you know, asking them the straight out question, you know, what makes you different than our competitor? Why are you, you know, why would someone want to go with your product and not your competitor's product? And, you know, I think it's a fair question, and it's very good for them, and they get it. And at the same way, I also tell the guests that there might be an ad on here that will be your competitor. And, you know, you can certainly buy the ad if you want it, but if it's not, you know, we have the sponsorships open for everyone, and we don't control what they say. It's very open in that way. So at least with the sponsors and with the guests, I am very clear on that. I try to make sure that they understand that entirely, that they're welcome to buy ads, but they don't have to. And in most cases, I personally like to actually have them on as a guest first, before their sponsors, so that they can, you know, be comfortable with experience, understand what we do, and then they can make the decision if they want to sponsor. There's been, I think, of our sponsors, 3 of them were sponsored first, and then the other 2 were guests first and then sponsored. So I guess it's, you know, almost 50-50, and that's kind of, either way, whatever they want to do. And I think they appreciate that. In most cases, people who are sponsors and hear that we have that integrity and we have that separation of church and state, I think they appreciate it because they know right away, oh, so this is actually real information that we're providing. It's not a paid content. And we probably should, now that it's coming out more, I should probably put on there that, you know, that our sponsors do not influence, you know, our editorial in any way. I should probably put that in, you know, disclaimer at the end or something.
Yeah. But you clearly call out, like, hey, this next, you know, 30 seconds or whatever is sponsored content. Like,
absolutely,
you introduce the ad.
There's a music stinger that we do, and then a voiceover, and then the actual ad, and then music stinger back to the editorial content.
Yeah, so it's clear to the listener. So you're not just like, you're not saying, getting a sponsored, like, this is probably a bad example, but a review of a microscope or something, and it's, you know, that sponsor, they're paying for that, but you're not actually saying, hey, we're going to sponsor, or, you know, a message from our sponsor, here's a microscope. That's what you would do, rather than, hey, this is a microscope that all doctors love, and, you know, talk about it without that.
Jace, you have a great idea. I will bring that idea back to the team to actually put a little more disclosure in there about what we're doing, because we are doing that, and that is our method. We just haven't really told our audience. Part of it, I think, is also that the doctors all have an understanding that when you do have a paid support, because that's the way doctors are, if they're paid by a company, they have to disclose it. So they know that not disclosing it means you're not being funded. So if we're not disclosing it in the doctor world, they know that means we're not being funded by that group. So, but you have a very good point. I think I'll do that. We'll bring it up to the team.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad I, you know, had a great idea on how to make money podcasting podcast. So awesome. Well, if kind of follow along with what you're doing at Digital Pathology Today, you can go to just search your podcast app, Digital Pathology Today. You can find that out. I believe you're on, you know, all the podcast players and probably social media as well. Is there anywhere else, Danny, that if somebody wanted to connect with you or learn more about what you're doing, where they could find you?
Certainly. I'm on Facebook under Dr. Schreiber. That's where I'm at. LinkedIn as well. We find that for our podcast, we find that most of our connections are through LinkedIn and through Twitter. That's where our audience tends to be, is on LinkedIn and Twitter. We actually don't even have a Facebook page at all. But we are on our website, which is www.digitalpathologytoday.com, and you can always reach out through there too.
Awesome. Well, Danny, thanks so much. It was great having you.
Thanks so much, Jason.